Hello, Unravelers. Welcome back to Tiff Unraveled. If you're new here, then welcome. I'm Tiff. I want you to picture like this postcard perfect version of America, if you will. You have quiet woods, a remote cabin, total and complete privacy. It's the kind of place that you would imagine someone escaping to for peace, for reflection, or maybe even now for the holidays. But instead of warmth and cheer, this cabin, it wasn't like that. This cabin held videotapes, disturbing manifestos, and rules created by two men who believed that they were building their own private world, a world without laws, a world without any morals, and a world without mercy. Leonard Lake dreamed it up, and Charles Ng helped make it real. Together, they were not just killers. They were collaborators. They documented their crimes like grotesque home movies, convinced that their twisted fantasy, something that they called Operation Miranda, would remain forever wrapped and hidden like a secret that no one would ever discover, a gift that no one would ever open. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng were not impulsive monsters at all. They were organized, they were patient, they were the kind of men who believed that if they planned everything carefully enough, if they stayed buried deep in those woods, that their secrets would never see the light of day. But all it takes is one cracked ornament, one small mistake. In this case, one $75 bench vise, and suddenly the entire tree comes crashing down. What followed was the unraveling of one of the most disturbing serial killer partnerships in American history. An investigation that exposed a lot of bad things that YouTube probably doesn't even really want me to say. We're going to find a way to talk about them. Disturbing, sexual violence, taking of lives on a scale that still shocks people even all these decades later. And fair warning, this is a long one. This case is heavy, it's complicated, and it's really not something that you can rush through. So I'm hoping that you'll settle in with me, you'll get comfortable, and hang out with me for the whole ride. Because once we start pulling these threads, there's really no easy stopping point. We just have to see it all the way through. As we wrap up this little series that I did, 'Tis the Serial Season on Tiff Unraveled, I really also just wanted to say thank you for your patience during a very hectic holiday stretch for me, and for sticking with me, even though a couple planned episodes didn't make it under the Tiff Unraveled tree this season, but for being here now. And it truly does mean everything. And if you're enjoying these deep dives, or if you enjoy the other content on my channel, which is really just a mishmash of everything true crime, some current stuff, some trial coverage, and then, older deep dives like this, just consider hitting like and subscribing to the channel. Think of it as leaving a little true crime tinsel on the channel this holiday season. It really does help me a lot more than you know, and it's like one of the best holiday gifts that you can give me. Anyway, grab your cocoa or something stronger. This is the story of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. This is a nightmare hidden behind survivalist fantasies and a cabin in the woods that held unimaginable horrors. And because 'tis the serial season, for our final episode, let's unravel. Let's start with Leonard Lake, because in a lot of ways, this entire nightmare began with him. Leonard, Thomas Lake. Leonard Lake, everyone. Leonard Lake was born on October 29th, 1945. He was born in San Francisco, California. On paper, he came from a fairly typical American family. His father's name was Elgin Leonard Lake, and his mother's name was Gloria May Williams. They had 3 children together. Leonard was the oldest, but Leonard wasn't very typical. The story takes a very dark turn pretty quickly, actually. When Leonard was just 6 years old, his parents did divorce. Now, divorce is traumatic for absolutely any child. But I think that what happened next really set the stage for something far more sinister. Leonard and his siblings were sent to live with their maternal grandmother. And this is where things just kind of get disturbing at 6 years old for Leonard Lake. Because according to multiple sources, this grandmother did something that I think would really go on to shape Leonard's twisted psychology for the rest of his life. She began encouraging young Leonard to start taking nude photographs of his younger sisters. I'll give you a second. We'll let that sink in for just a moment. A grandmother encouraging a young boy to photograph his sisters in inappropriate ways. This was not like innocent childhood curiosity. It was the beginning of an obsession with pornography and a control that I think would define Leonard Lake's entire existence. And it didn't stop there either. Leonard allegedly took this a step further and started extorting sexual favors from his sisters in exchange for protecting them from their violent youngest brother, Donald. This is how the story goes. But by his teenage years, Leonard Lake had developed an absolute fascination with what he called collecting women, which was this whole idea of keeping women as slaves, basically. And the fantasy was fueled by a novel called The Collector, which was written by a man named John Fowles or Foles. I'm not sure. Fowles. In the book, the premise is a man kidnaps a woman named Miranda, hold on to that, and keeps her locked in his cellar, believing that if he holds her long enough, she'll eventually fall in love with him. Spoiler alert, she doesn't. She dies. But for Leonard Lake, this was not read as like a cautionary tale. It was a blueprint for him. Leonard Lake's disturbing behaviors extended far beyond his sexual obsessions. He would reportedly unalive mice by dissolving them in chemicals, a method that he would actually go on to later use to dispose of human remains as well. Think about that. As a child, he was already experimenting with ways to make bodies disappear. This wasn't just cruelty to animals. It was cruelty to animals, but it was something far more than that. It was rehearsal. In 1964, at the age of 19 years old, Leonard Lake enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. He served 2 tours of duty during the Vietnam War, working as a radar electronics technician. Now, one might think that military service would straighten him out, give him discipline, maybe give him some purpose. But instead, it's actually where his mental health issues became impossible to ignore. During his time in Da Nang, Lake suffered what was termed then as a delusional breakdown. He was diagnosed at the time with schizoid personality disorder, and he underwent 2 years of psychiatric treatment at Camp Pendleton. In 1971, Leonard Lake received a medical discharge from the United States Marine Corps. At the time, he was 26 years old. He was mentally unstable, and he was about to enter civilian life with no real direction whatsoever. He settled down in San Jose, California, and he briefly attended San Jose State University, but he dropped out after just one semester. Why? Well, it was around that time that Leonard discovered San Francisco's hippie community, and it was a much better fit for his lifestyle. Leonard Lake actually moved to a commune in San Francisco, and he got married 1969, but the marriage that marriage didn't last long. His wife actually discovered that Leonard was making and starring in amateur graphic films, usually involving the thing, BDSM, right? For just so I don't have to say it all out. Is that what it is? And here's the kicker. These films didn't just feature Leonard. They also featured his wife without her knowledge. And they featured other women that he was bringing in without his wife's knowledge. He was tying them up. He was dominating them all, while he was married to this woman. So the marriage dissolved pretty quickly after that discovery. For the next 8 years, Leonard Lake lived at the Greenfield Ranch, which was this massive 5,600-acre back to the land settlement near Calpella, which is north of Ukiah, California. So this was the 1970s. Remember, the era of communes and free love and, getting back to nature. Leonard Lake was not there for peace and love. I promise you. He was there because it gave him space, privacy, and freedom from prying eyes. Scrutiny. In 1975, Leonard Lake met a woman named Clarilyn Balaz. Friends called Clarilyn Cricket, and that's how I'll refer to her throughout this episode. And here's where it gets interesting. Cricket accepted Lake's fantasies. She willingly appeared in his films. She participated in his, bondage and such scenarios. She knew who he was and what he wanted, and she married him anyway in 1981. She was fine with it, I guess. But Leonard Lake's obsessions were growing much darker. He became increasingly paranoid about nuclear war. He was convinced that a global holocaust was imminent. He actually started construction on a bunker at Greenfield Ranch, where he was stockpiling weapons and supplies. And his plan was to survive the apocalypse and rebuild civilization with himself as the patriarch and a collection of female slaves to repopulate the earth. And he called this plan Operation Miranda. Remember, the captive woman from the book, The Collector. The owner of the Greenfield Ranch actually did eventually discover Leonard's bunker project, and he ordered that he stopped it immediately. And, Leonard stopped and he left. But at this point, the seed had been fully planted. Leonard Lake now had a fully formed fantasy: survive the end of the world, collect women, use them however he wanted to, and when he was done with them, dispose of them. And all he needed was the right spot and the right partner. 1982, the location materialized. So Leonard's wife, Cricket, owned property through her parents. She owned a very remote cabin near Wilseyville in Calaveras County, which was about 150 miles east of San Francisco. It was isolated. It was surrounded by woods. It was very far from prying eyes. In Leonard's eyes, this was perfect. Perfect. And the partner, well, he was about to walk in to Leonard's life. So Charles Cheetah Ing enters the chat. He was born on December 24th, 1960 in British Hong Kong. And unlike Lake, who came from sort of a broken middle class family. He was actually the son of very wealthy Chinese parents. His father was a successful executive. His family had money, they had status, they had connections, and Charles was the youngest of three children, and he was also the only son. Literally, by all accounts, he should have had every single advantage in his life. But Charles Ng was trouble from the very beginning. As a child, Charles Ng was very harshly disciplined by his father. And we're not talking about like the occasional spanking here. It was severe and possibly abusive punishment that Charles Ng would later claim shaped his violent tendencies. Whether that's true or that's just an excuse, we'll never really know for sure. Again, we know that a lot of children come from abusive households and they don't grow up to be what Charles Ng grew up to be. So, take that for what you will. But what we do know is that by his teenage years, Ng had established a very clear pattern of behavior, theft, violence, and a complete disregard for the rules. What's that? He didn't care. He was expelled from school in Hong Kong. His parents, they were, I think, hoping that like a change of environment would help him. And so they sent him to Bentham Grammar School, which was a very expensive boarding school in North Yorkshire, England. It didn't help at all. Ng was expelled again from this school, this time for stealing from his fellow students. The pattern was very clear. Charles Ng was a thief. He wasn't really a great child, and he wasn't going to stop. So in 1978, at age 18, Ng moved to the United States on a student visa. He enrolled at the College of Notre Dame in Belmont, California to study biology, but he dropped out after just one semester, same as his counterpart, Leonard Lake. Why? Well, Ng had been involved in a hit-and-run accident, and rather than face the music, coward, apparently, on top of all the other things that he is, he decided to disappear, and he joined the military. How did he do that? Well, in October of 1979, he enlisted also in the United States Marine Corps. But here's the thing, he shouldn't have been able to enlist. Like at all. He wasn't even a U.S. citizen, and he'd entered the country on a student visa. So how did he pull it off? Well, he lied, and he also had the help of the recruiting sergeant. He had false documents, and he claimed that his birthplace was Bloomington, Indiana, and the Marines bought it, and so he enlisted. But his time in the Marine Corps was very short-lived. In less than a year, he was arrested by military police for, guess what? Stealing. What was he stealing? Automatic weapons from the Kanoe, I don't know how to say, Kanoe Bay base armory in Hawaii. And we're not talking about a pistol or two either, okay? Ng and two accomplices stole $11,000 worth of weapons, including 3 automatic machine guns, 7 revolvers, and a night sighting scope. Oh, and 3 grenade launchers. I just spit a little bit when I said that, but that's crazy. After his arrest, he went through some psychiatric evaluations because I think the Marines were like, this dude's got to be crazy, right? What else? Anyway, but Ng made some very chilling statements during his psychiatric evaluations. He boasted about assassinating someone in California, though he never went on to provide any details regarding that. He also claimed that he had laced salt shakers in the mess hall with cyanide. Was this true? I don't know. Thankfully, no one died from this little stunt. We do know that. He also admitted to firing a grenade launcher at a staff sergeant, and somehow that grenade turned out to be a dud. The psychiatrist who evaluated Ng noted that most of his stories seemed to come from quite an overactive imagination. You know the thing I'm talking about. And a desire to be dangerous. But here's the thing. Some of those stories actually turned out to be true. Ng at this point was facing a court-martial, but during that time, he escaped custody in 1980. And when he did, he made his way to Northern California. He was listed by the United States Marine Corps as a deserter. And that's when he met his pal, Leonard Lake. The exact details of how Lake and Ng met are a little bit murky, but most sources agree that it happened in either 1980 or 1981. Leonard Lake had placed an advertisement in a survivalist magazine. He was at the time managing a hotel in Philo. I hate how bad I am at words. California. Okay. At that time. And Charles Ng responded to that ad, and the two men reportedly they hit it off immediately. I mean, honestly, think about what they had in common. They were both former Marines. They had both been arrested for weapons violations. They were both fascinated by violence, by control, and they were both kind of living on like the fringes of society. Lake was the older, more dominant personality. So, he was the planner. He was the philosopher, the one with all these grand ideas and, fantasies. The one with the grand vision, right? Ng at the time, well, obviously still now, Ng was younger. He was much more impulsive. He was more physically violent. And several witnesses would actually later testify that Leonard Lake was very clearly the dominant figure in that relationship, and that Charles Ng would say that he looked up to Lake as like a brotherly, fatherly figure. You can't be both. Pick one, but I get what you mean, I guess. So in April of 1982, federal agents actually raided the property where Ng was living with Lake and Cricket, Lake's wife. What is in my mouth? They at that time seized a very large stash of illegal weapons and even some explosives, and both men were arrested on weapons charges. Ng, don't forget, he was still technically a Marine Corps deserter. And so at that time, he was returned to Fort Leavenworth to complete his sentence there. Leonard Lake actually jumped bail and went into hiding and started using like a bunch of aliases and disguises. Charles Ng struck a plea deal with military prosecutors, pled guilty to like the theft and the desertion in exchange for a promise that he would serve no more than 3 years of a 14-year sentence. And he was actually paroled after 18 months, and he was dishonorably discharged from the U.S. Marine Corps in 1984. Where did he go when he got out? Well, that's a great question. Unravelers. He went straight back to Leonard Lake, his father friend. By this time, Leonard Lake had settled in to that remote cabin in Wilseyville that we talked about that was owned by his wife, or it gets complicated, ex-wife, eventually, because by that time, Cricket had divorced him. She divorced him after his arrest, but apparently they remained on pretty friendly terms. Next to the cabin, Leonard Lake had built something that he described in his own journals as a dungeon. His words. It was a fortified bunker. It was hidden from view. It was soundproofed, and it was equipped with absolutely everything that he would need to carry out this twisted fantasy of his that he'd been holding on to this fantasy. As far back as we've been talking about Operation Miranda. He wanted that to become a reality, and it was about to. Let me paint you a picture of this place, because understanding this location is very crucial to understanding how Leonard Lake and Charles Ng got away with their crimes for so long. So Wilseyville is a very tiny community in Calaveras County. It's nestled in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. It's about 150 miles east of San Francisco, but honestly, this place might as well be on another planet. Let me readjust. Okay, this is rural. Fuck, I don't think I did that very good. Okay, this is rural. You guys know what I mean. Okay, California. So we're talking about like dense forests, lots of like winding dirt roads, and properties that were separated by like acres of land. Your nearest neighbor might be half a mile away, and if you screamed, no one would hear you. And they liked that aspect of where they were. The cabin itself sat on 2.5 acres of woodland. It was a very modest structure. It was 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a bathroom. It was absolutely nothing fancy, but it was the bunker that made this property special, different, stand out. Lake had enlisted the help, get this, of neighbors to construct this bunker, and he was telling them that he was like building a bomb shelter in case of nuclear war. Remember that this was mid 1980s, right? This is like the height of Cold War paranoia. A survivalist building a bunker in the middle of nowhere, it wasn't really that weird, I don't think. It was just people were like, oh, he's just being prepared. He's just getting ready. You know what I mean? Yeah, but it wasn't a bomb shelter. It was a torture chamber, literally. The bunker was a cinder block structure. It was partially underground. It was reinforced with walls that were like thick enough to muffle screams. That was literally the entire point of the walls. And inside of that bunker, Lake had created like a workshop area with hand tools and power saws that were like hanging on the walls. And many of these tools, investigators would later discover, were actually encrusted with dried blood. But the workshop was just the front room of this bunker, because behind a plywood wall that looked like a tool rack, was a hidden door. And behind that door was the real horror of this bunker. It was a small room. It was about 12 feet by 7 feet. It had a double bed, a side table or nightstand, some books, and a reading lamp. And on one wall hung a wooden plaque that read Operation Miranda. So this room contained military equipment, uniforms, books, a vast array of weapons like assault rifles, shotguns, machine guns. But the most disturbing features of the room were the ones that were designed for captivity, because that was the ultimate goal. That was the ultimate purpose that this room served, was to hold women captive. There was a small window made of 2-way glass. It was soundproofed with multiple panes. And next to it was a button that, when pushed, allowed the occupants of this room to hear sounds from the cell on the other side of that 2-way window. And then Lake had a military starlight scope, which was originally a scope that was designed for snipers to see in like really low light conditions. And he would use that to watch his captives in complete darkness. On the walls were 21 photos of women, young women, in various stages of undress. Most of these photos were taken outdoors, but 2 of the photos had been taken in front of a wallpaper with like cartoon character motif, and investigators would later identify this wallpaper as being from the South City Juvenile Hall, which was where Cricket worked as a teacher. We're not talking about Cricket right now, but Cricket. All 21 women in these photographs were actually identified and found alive. Thank God. but they were the lucky ones. Behind another hidden door, yes, another hidden door, was the cell itself. It was tiny. It was 3 feet 3 inches wide by 7.5 feet long. Like, you know what I mean? So inside of this cell was a very narrow bed, a very small, weird looking toilet, an air freshener, and a container for water. Holes had been drilled in the wall for ventilation, but they were kind of obstructed to obscure any light from coming into this cell. This was literally like a sensory deprivation chamber. It was a place where these women would be kept in complete darkness, isolated, terrified, and completely at the mercy of their captors. Outside of this bunker, Leonard Lake had built, get ready for it, an incinerator with very thick fireproof walls that were capable of withstanding extreme temperatures. And this is where, you guessed it, he disposed of bodies. He would burn them until nothing remained but fragments of them. He also had a chicken coop, and investigators would later theorize that the smaller bone fragments and flesh were actually fed to these chickens. So this was the stage. So now let's talk about the performance. Leonard Lake was a very prolific writer. He kept very detailed journals, constantly documenting his thoughts, his plans, and eventually his crimes. These journals would actually become very crucial evidence in the case against Charles Ng, but they also gave us a very disturbing look into Leonard Lake's psyche. In his writings, Leonard Lake would describe women in purely utilitarian terms. God meant women for cooking, cleaning house, and he wrote that. Those are his words, not mine. I promise, not mine. Quote, "And when they are not in use, they should be locked up," unquote. Another often repeated motto in his diaries was, quote, "If you love something, let it go. If it doesn't come back, hunt it down and kill it," unquote. This guy is quite a fucking peach, isn't he? Leonard Lake also made a ton of videotapes. He would record himself as he was explaining his philosophy. In one tape, he was seated very comfortably in his recliner, while God knows who was chained up in his bunker, suffering. Leonard Lake very calmly describes his fantasy. Quote, "What I want is an off-the-shelf sex partner. I want to be able to use a woman in any way that I want. And when I'm bored, I want to simply be able to put her away," unquote. Yeah. He continues, quote, "What I want is a slave. There's no way around it. Primarily a sexual slave, but nonetheless a physical slave as well. At this moment, I'm going to try to get it. It will be interesting to see how far this tape and I actually go," unquote. Think about the chilling casualness of this statement. He's talking about kidnapping, enslaving, and eventually unaliving women in the same way that you or I might have a conversation about like buying a new car this weekend. There's literally no emotion. There's no recognition that he's actually describing human beings. To Leonard Lake, women were objects, tools, things to be used, and then things to be discarded. Disgusting. Garbage. In early 1984, Leonard Lake recorded very detailed plans for his bondage cell. He described exactly how he would soundproof it, how he would install the two-way mirror, and how he would ensure that his captives could never escape from it. This is not a fantasy anymore. He's literally laying out the blueprints here. And then when Charles Ng was released from Leavenworth and rejoined Leonard Lake at the Wilseyville cabin, this is when Operation Miranda was actually ready to begin. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng developed a very specific pattern for their crimes, and understanding this pattern is very crucial to understanding the full scope of their evil. First, they would identify targets, and these were usually people that they knew or had some sort of connection to, like acquaintances, coworkers, or people who had advertised things for sale. Leonard Lake was particularly fond of targeting people who owned things that he wanted, like cars, video equipment, identification documents. Why buy something when you can just take the life of the person who owns it and take that thing for yourself? We're saving money here. Men and male children were usually unalived immediately, and it usually was just with like a single gunshot wound to the head. Lake and Ng really had no use for them beyond their possessions and possibly identities, right? But women, well, women were a different story for Leonard and Charles. Women were taken to the bunker. They were taken to the cell behind the two-way mirror. They were stripped, they were restrained, and they were subjected to what Leonard Lake called training. Yeah. The videotapes that investigators later found show exactly what this training entailed. Women were forced to strip while Leonard and Charles watched and filmed. They were told that their husbands and their children were already unalived, and they were given a choice at that point. They were given the choice to cooperate and live as slaves or refuse and be tortured and killed anyway. So, of course, as you can guess, cooperation actually didn't save them at all. Once Charles Ng and Leonard Lake were finished with their victims, these women, once they had extracted every ounce of suffering and degradation that they possibly could extract from these women, they were unalived. Their bodies were burned in that incinerator that we talked about, or they were buried in shallow graves, around the property. I guess whatever they felt like doing that day. Oh, my throat is getting tight. I'm getting mad. Okay, 2 seconds. This is why I said at the beginning of the episode, maybe grab something stronger than your hot cocoa. Anyway, all right. Leonard Lake's journals. We talked about, all the pages that he kept in great detail. His journals would indicate that Charles Ng at first was initially hesitant to participate in the murders. Leonard wrote, quote, "Ng was very hesitant to get involved with my plan," unquote. But that hesitation didn't last too long at all, because very soon after Ng got comfortable, he was a very enthusiastic participant. He was actually often taking the lead in the torture and assault of all of their victims. The two men worked together like a very well-oiled machine. Lake was the planner. He was the one who selected all of the targets. He orchestrated the kidnappings of these women. And Charles Ng was the muscle. He was the one who enjoyed the physical violence. And together, for a while, they were quite unstoppable. Or so they thought. So we can talk about these two heads all day long. We could. And I mean, that's what we've been talking about, but that's not why we're here. Now we come to the hardest part of this story and the part that I find the most important. We're going to talk about the victims. Because again, while it is very easy for all of us to get caught up in the horror of what Lake and Ing did, we cannot forget every single one of their crimes had a victim, a real person or people with family, friends, community, with a life that was stolen from them. And that's what we're going to talk about now, because I want to. The exact number of victims that Ing and Lake actually had, I don't think it will ever really be known. Charles Ing was convicted of 11 murders, and investigators believe that the true number is probably somewhere closer to 25. But what we are going to do is we're going to talk about the ones that we do know, the ones whose names we can speak and whose stories deserve to be told. So let's get into the first victims. It's actually theorized that Leonard Lake's first victim was his own brother, Donald. Donald was 31 years old. He was mentally disabled, and this was a result of him being hit by a train as a child. By a train, you heard that right. As a result of this accident, Donald had, some issues. Leonard resented Donald, allegedly, or reportedly, or maybe even just my opinion. There was some resentment there. And the reason for this resentment was that Donald, because of, of the accident and his subsequent, state of mind, their mother devoted all of her attention to caring for him, which made Leonard feel like he was left to be raised by the grandparents who we talked about in the beginning of this episode. Not good people. At least grandma. I don't know. I didn't see a lot about grandpa, but grandma wasn't she wasn't good. She wasn't good. So in conversations with his ex-wife, Cricket, Lake would refer to Donald as a leech and said that he didn't deserve to live. In December of 1982, Donald was living with his mother in San Francisco when Leonard stopped by and asked him to come along to a house sitting job. And Leonard picked Donald up from his mother's house that day, and Donald was never seen again. Leonard resurfaced on New Year's Day in 1983, started renting a room under the name of Alan Drey, Drey. I don't know, Drey. It wasn't a real name, so it doesn't really matter. And he had stolen Donald's identity and then started cashing Donald's disability checks. I think that I read in a few places that he had even forged a written letter to their mother claiming to be Donald and saying that he had moved to Reno, Nevada to live with drug dealers. So you couldn't even write. Okay. It's like you have to. Okay. All right. Donald Lake's body has actually never been found to this day. 4 months later, in May of 1983, Lake moved in with his friend, and his friend's name was Charles Donald Gunner. Charles Gunner was 34 years old. He had been the best man at Lake's wedding to Cricket in 1981, and he was very overweight. He stood at 5'8" tall, and he weighed nearly 400 pounds, which is why Cricket named him the Fat Man. Yeah, good on you, Cricket. Very fucking original, I guess. On May 20th, 1983, Lake invited Gunner on a road trip to Las Vegas. Several days later, surprise, surprise, Lake returned alone, and he was driving Gunner's van. He told acquaintances that Gunner had run off with some woman in Las Vegas, and Gunner was never seen again. Lake then stole Gunner's identity and began cashing his government checks. He introduced himself actually as Charles Gunner to most of the people that he met in Williesville, where the cabin was. Gunner's body wasn't found during the initial investigation in 1985, but in September of 1992, when a new owner of the Williesville property was digging to install, I don't know, something in the garage, he unearthed Gunner's remains. So these were Leonard Lake's first known victims. This is not to say that this hadn't happened before, because I mean, who really knows? This guy is certifiably banana nut bread, okay? But these victims were unalived before Charles Ng ever even entered the picture. But once Charles Ng joined him in 1984, this all accelerated big time. So I want to talk about the Dubs family. On July 25th, 1984, Harvey Dubs, his wife Deborah, and their infant son, Sean, disappeared from their San Francisco apartment. Harvey was 30 years old at the time. He worked as a photographer in San Francisco. Deborah was 33. And Sean was just a year old. That night, Deborah was on the phone with a friend and her doorbell rang. She told her friend, "Hey, someone's at the door. I need to go. I'll call you back." When she goes to answer the door, there were two men there, and the Dubs family was never heard from again. What happened to them was later revealed through the videotapes that were found at Leonard Lake's cabin. Okay. Harvey and baby Sean were immediately unalived, but I'm sure you can guess what happened to Deborah. Deborah was taken to the bunker. The tapes actually show Deborah being sexually assaulted so severely. Oh, why did I choose this line of work? It hurts me so much, but it's important. The tape, oh, my head hurts. Oh, God. The tape that investigators found shows Deborah, again, I'm going to try this again, being sexually assaulted so severely that investigators said that from that assault alone, that sexual assault, she, quote, could not have survived. There were screams, there were pleas for her baby and for her husband, and all of that was captured on their 6th video. How did he find the Dubs family? Well, the Dubs family had advertised video equipment for sale in a local newspaper, and that is how Leonard and Charles found them. They wanted the equipment, and so they took it. And along with the video equipment, they took the lives of a husband, a wife, and a son. They took Deborah into that bunker, and when they were done with her, they took her life and burned her body in that incinerator. This is fucking infuriating. All right, I need another 2 minutes, 2 seconds for you. Okay, so now that brings us to Paul Costner. On November 2nd, 1984, Paul Costner left his San Francisco apartment to show his Honda Prelude to a potential buyer. He told his girlfriend that the buyer was a, quote, weird guy, unquote. And Paul Costner never came back from that meeting. Leonard Lake's diaries actually contain an entry for that exact date. And it said, quote, Friday, November 2nd, 1984, Charlie performed op, met resistance for the first time, unsuccessful in obtaining credit cards or bank codes, drove to country for completion, canceled Charlie's running debt to me. Performed op, drove to country for completion. Like literally Leonard Lake is describing this unaliving with the clinical detachment of someone walking into the county clerk's office and applying for a business license. No emotion. In fact, I feel like someone applying for a business license might have more emotional attachment to that transaction than Leonard did to this one. You know what I will say? I will say that I believe wholeheartedly, based on his own diary entry, that Paul Costner fought back. I feel like that is 100% what met resistance for the first time means. But it didn't save him. It didn't save Paul. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng took his life, took his car, and disposed of his body. Here's another thing. Paul Costner's body has never been found. But his car was the Honda Prelude that he told his girlfriend he was going to the meeting to sell. That Honda Prelude was the car that Leonard Lake was driving when he was arrested in 1985. That car is what led the police to Wilseyville. And so I feel like in some way, our guy, Paul Costner, got his revenge from beyond the grave. He was the key here. So now I want to go into the Bond O'Connor family. So in April of 1985, Lonnie Bond Sr., his girlfriend, Brenda O'Connor, and their infant son, Lonnie Jr., lived in a house that was just 50 yards, okay? Half a football field, American football field. I don't know where my audience is coming from right now. American football, 100 yards, half of that. So close. So close. They lived 50 yards away from Leonard Lake's cabin. They had rented that property from a man named Bo Carter. At the time, there was a man staying with them. His name was Robin Scott Stapley. This was a 26-year-old friend that had actually founded the San Diego chapter of the biker organization, the Guardian Angels. Now, Robin was there for a reason. The reason was Lake. Brenda O'Connor didn't trust Leonard Lake, who, by the way, had introduced himself to that family as his friend Charles Gunner, who we believe he had already taken the life of. Brenda had actually told friends that she had seen Lake bury a body in the woods. Girl. But instead of calling the police, Brenda called Robin Stapley, because she felt like if this man was staying there with them, they would be protected from Leonard Lake, this man that lived next door to her that she didn't trust because she had seen him bury a body in the woods. This woman was terrified. Terrified. And so she called Robin to stay with them, to protect them, essentially. But it didn't help. In April of 1985, all 4 of them disappeared. And how do we know what happened to them? Well, once again, it was because of the videotapes that were found at Leonard Lake's cabin showing what happened to Brenda. Brenda had been tied to a chair. She was seen tied to a chair in the video. Brenda was pleading for her life in the video. And her husband and her son and her friend, Robin, were all forced to watch what occurred in absolute horror. Charles Ng unties her from the chair, forces her to strip, and she is then put in leg irons, and sexually assaulted by both Charles Ng and Leonard Lake. At one point, Leonard Lake is heard on video telling her, I hate this man. I hate both of these men. Quote, by cooperating with us, that means you will stay here as a prisoner. You will work for us. You will wash for us. And you will for us. Or you can say no, in which case we will tie you to the bed. We will you. And then we'll take you outside and we'll shoot you. Your choice. Brenda O'Connor's remains were identified in 2025. This year, her remains were just identified using investigative genetic genealogy. Lonnie Bond Sr. and Robin Stapley's bodies were found buried in a shallow grave about a mile from Leonard Lake's property. Baby Lonnie Jr.'s body still has never been found. All right, 2 more seconds. I gotta take quick pauses in between all of these because they're very heavy. Hold tight. I told you guys this was a long one. If you're still settled in, comfy, cozy, or if you're still listening, let me know down below. Say hi. I'm glad we've made it this far. Thank you for being here with me. It just gets heavier. So now we're going to talk about Kathleen Allen. Kathleen Allen was 18 years old. She worked as a clerk at a supermarket in Milpitas. Oh my God. I don't know. Milpitas. Milpitas. If you guys know how to say that, also, please let me know down below. I'm terrible at words. I don't know why I'm doing this. I don't know why I'm doing this thing where I use a lot of words. So Kathleen knew Charles Ng, actually. She knew him because her boyfriend, whose name was Michael Sean Carroll, had been Charles Ng's cellmate at Leavenworth Prison. Michael Carroll was 22 years old and he had come west after his release to join Charles Ng in various criminal enterprises. On April 12, 1985, Carroll told Allen that he had to leave their motel room for a little bit and he never came back. 3 days later, Kathleen had received a phone call at work and she was told that Carroll had been shot and that his body had been found near Lake Tahoe. She immediately left work and she was seen getting into a vehicle with Leonard Lake, which brings us to the found videotapes. The videotapes showed Kathleen Allen chained to a chair and Lake warns her on the video. He says, quote, if you don't go along with us, we'll probably take you into the bed, tie you down, you, and bury you. In another segment, Charles Ng is seen cutting her shirt off with a knife and telling her, quote, you can cry and stuff like the rest of them, but it won't do you any good. We're pretty cold-hearted, so to speak, unquote. Kathleen Allen's final paycheck was mailed to Leonard Lake's address in Wilseyville, and her body was one of those found on his property. We have Clifford Parento. He was 23 years old. He's working with Charles Ng at Dennis Moving Company in 1985. He had won $400 on a Super Bowl bet and told coworkers that he was, quote, going to the country to spend it with Ng. He was never seen again. In April 1985, Leonard Lake sold Parento's motorcycle to a man in West Point, California. Jeffrey Gerald. He was 25 years old. He disappeared in February of 1985 after agreeing to help Charles Ng move some furniture. His driver's license was found at the Wilseyville property. Donald Giulietti. He was a 36-year-old DJ in San Francisco. He was openly gay. He had placed a personal ad offering oral to straight men. On July 11th, 1984, a man came to his apartment and shot him in the head at close range. His roommate, Richard Carrazza, was also shot, but ultimately survived the wounds. Carrazza identified Charles Ng as the shooter of his roommate. Giulietti is the only victim where Ng was directly witnessed committing the unaliving. Randy Jacobson, he was a 34-year-old unemployed drifter who vanished in October of 1984 after going to sell his van to Leonard Lake. His body was later found under a chicken coop on that Wilseyville property. Cheryl Okoro, she was 26 years old. She was beautiful. Gosh, she was beautiful. Maurice Rock was 38 years old. He had braided hair. He wore gold chains. And both of them lived at the Pink Palace, which was a rooming house in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. Both disappeared after encounters with Leonard Lake, and pieces of their bodies were fed to the chickens. Their bones were found in the woods near that bunker. And then we have Reggie Frisbee. He was 29 years old when he disappeared from San Francisco in January of 1984. His remains were found in June of 1985, but he wasn't identified again until this year, January 2025. 41 years later, also using investigative genetic genes. For 4 decades, he was just an unknown victim. He was a set of bones in an evidence locker, and now, finally, his family has answers. But this, to me, is a truly terrifying part of this entire thing. These are just the victims that we know about. When investigators excavated the Wilseyville property, they found more than 45 pounds of burned and crushed human bone fragments. The forensic analysis determined that these fragments came from at least 11 bodies, but possibly as many as 25. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng kept a treasure map, and this is what led investigators to buried buckets that contained personal belongings like driver's licenses, credit cards, jewelry, photographs, One bucket that they found actually contained an envelope with the names and identifications, suggesting the total number of victims, like I said, might have been as high as 25. So 21 women, like we talked about earlier, were photographed in the various states of undress. 6 of those women were found alive. They were identified and found alive. 15 of those women were never identified. So I need to clarify that, because when I was reading my notes earlier in this episode, I said that all of those women were found and they were identified and they were found alive. I was wrong. When I started doing more digging, more researching in between the recording of these segments, so 6 of those 21 that were on the wall found, identified, alive. 15 never identified. So that begs the question, are those 15 among the bone fragments that were found when the property was excavated? Did they escape? And I really do fear that we'll likely never know the answer to that question. Think about that. 15 women whose images were captured by these monsters, whose faces we can see, and we don't even know their names. They are someone's daughters. They are maybe someone's sister. They're maybe someone's mothers. Families out there are probably still wondering what happened to their loved one, never knowing that the answer lies in a box of fucking photographs in an evidence locker. This is the true horror of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. Not just the people that they took, but the people who simply vanish around them, whose stories may never get the chance to be told, and whose families may never have the closure that they need and that they deserve. So, how did all of this come crashing down? How did two men who had successfully unalived at least 11 people and possibly even more than twice that finally get caught? Well, remember that little thing I mentioned at the beginning of this episode in the intro when I said a $75 bench vice? Yeah, it was that. On June 2nd, 1985, Charles Ng walked in to the South City lumber store in South San Francisco. He browsed around for a bit. He picked up a bench vise and he slipped it under his jacket. And an employee spotted him and confronted him out in the parking lot before he could leave. What did Charles Ng do? Well, Charles Ng tossed the vise into the trunk of a Honda Prelude. Remember Paul Costner, the Honda Prelude? Yeah. The Prelude was parked outside. Charles Ng tossed the vise into the trunk of it. And guess what he did? He took off running because this guy's a fucking wimp. He's a fucking coward. He ran. The employee went inside, called the police. And when Officer Daniel Wright arrived to the scene, the car was still there. And inside that car was Leonard Lake. Leonard Lake was very calm, almost eerily so, actually. And he produced a sales receipt and he said, "Here's the receipt. I've paid for the vice my friend took. There's no need for the police." The police, they agreed to disagree in this regard. Officer Wright was buying it. So he ran the car's registration and discovered that the license plate on the car actually came back to a Buick owned by someone named Lonnie Bond. Yeah, our guy Lonnie. The license plate didn't come back to the Honda. Then he looked in the trunk and he found not just the stolen vice, of course that was there, but he also found a loaded .22 caliber revolver equipped with an illegal silencer. So Leonard Lake produces his driver's license, but the driver's license he produced is in the name of Robin Scott Stapley. Photo, but the photo on the license showed a young man in his 20s, right? Because Robin was young. We saw his picture. Robin was young, strapping, handsome guy. This is Leonard Lake. This guy that he's seeing in the seat of this car does not match the strapping young fellow on the driver's license. Lake was clearly in his late 30s at this time. So Officer Wright arrested Lake for possession of an illegal weapon and took him to the South San Francisco police station. At the station, though, things got even weirder. Can you believe that? So a check of the Honda's VIN number, right? The vehicle identification number. I guess saying VIN number is redundant. It's just the VIN. That makes sense. Okay. A check of the Honda's VIN revealed that it belonged to, well, we knew the Honda Prelude belonged to Paul Costner, who had been missing at this point for 9 months. The gun was registered to Robin Stapley, who had also been reported missing, and also whose driver's license was produced when police asked for identification. So Leonard Lake was immediately placed into an interrogation room, right? He asked for a pen, paper, and a glass of water. And then he scribbled a note to his ex-wife, Cricket, and placed it in his shirt pocket. And then he said something that probably should have been a massive red flag. He said, quote, "I didn't think that a lousy bench vice would bring me to this." Officer Wright asked him, "I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Can you say that again?" And upon being asked to repeat himself, Lake then admitted his real identity and revealed his accomplice's name. He said, "That guy that ran away, that was Charles Cheetah Ng." And he said cheetah, pronounced cheetah, just in case there was any confusion. And ing, pronounced ing, he said. Okay, thanks for that. And then, before anybody could stop him, Leonard Lake removed something from the lapel of his shirt, placed it in his mouth, and within seconds, his eyes rolled back in his head and he went into convulsions. He'd swallowed a cyanide capsule, one of two actually, that he had taped to the underside of his shirt lapel. The guy's just walking around with cyanide. He's ready at any moment to be caught and identified as the piece of that he is. And he can't bear that. And so, in the event of that happening, he keeps the cyanide in his breast pockets. Okay, Leonard. Two cowardly dogs. They want to be dominant. They want to be the patriarch. They want to be, ruler of all and the populator of the new world. But at the end of the day, Ingran Lake swallowed cyanide rather than face the music. So, anyhow, Leonard Lake was then rushed to Kaiser Permanente Hospital, where he was then placed on life support and he never regained consciousness. That's me playing my tiny violin. Can you hear? No? Okay. I'll quit. On June 6, 1985, 4 days after his arrest, Leonard Lake was pronounced dead, and he was 39 years old at the time of his death. He had cheated justice, in my opinion. But he had also, unfortunately for him and unfortunately for his counterpart, left behind a trail of evidence that would lead investigators straight to his house of horrors. So there was a utility bill that was found in Leonard Lake's car that led San Francisco police detectives Tom Eisenman and Irene Brunn to Cricket. She told them that the address on the bill belonged to a cabin that her parents owned near Wilseyville. She agreed to take them there the next day. But when they met up, she admitted that she had already been to the cabin before they got there that morning, looking for nude videos that Lake had made of her. And just, wanting to save herself from that embarrassment. Detectives were not thrilled about this, as you can imagine, but they did proceed into the cabin anyway. And what they found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The cabin itself showed signs of violence. There were reddish brown stains on the living room ceiling. There was a bullet hole in the mural on the wall. There was another bullet hole in the kitchen floor that they found. And in the master bedroom, they found a 4-poster bed with electrical cords tied to each post and heavy eye bolts drilled through the floor at each corner of that 4-poster bed. A 250-watt floodlight was mounted on the wall above the bed. Why? In the dresser in the master bedroom, they found women's lingerie, and much of that lingerie was stained with what appeared to be dried blood. Under the mattress was another mattress, which was also heavily stained. They moved to the living room, and in the living room, they found a television and audio equipment with the serial numbers erased, scratched out. These items would later be traced to our first victims, Harvey Dubs, who had disappeared with his entire family in July of 1984. But the real horror was waiting for police outside. Next to the cabin stood that cinder block bunker. Cricket Balaz initially refused to give police any information and refused to give police any permission to even search it. But they did obtain a search warrant, and investigators opened up that bunker on June 4th, 1985. Inside of that bunker, they found the workshop with all of the blood-encrusted tools. They found the hidden room with the Operation Miranda plaque on the wall. And then they found the two-way mirror, and they found the starlight scope, and they found the photographs of those 21 women. And then they found the cell, that tiny, dark, soundproofed cell where women had been kept and caged like animals. They also found, they found the videotapes. So many videotapes, lots of videotapes, and like journals, hundreds of pages of journals documenting his crimes in very chilling detail. Outside, investigators start excavating the property itself. They found a hand-drawn treasure map that led them to buried 5-gallon buckets, the buckets that we talked about, containing personal belongings of missing persons. They found an incinerator with thick, fireproof walls, and they found bones, so many bones. On June the 8th, portions of 4 human skeletons were unearthed near the bunker. On June 13th, a 5th victim was discovered, along with numerous charred bone fragments, including infants' teeth. On June 18th, a 6th body was found. On June 26th, 3 more skeletons were sorted out of scattered fragments. By the time the excavation was complete, investigators had discovered the remains of, as we said, at least 11 people, along with the 45 pounds of bone fragments that couldn't be identified. The videotapes were perhaps the most damning evidence, of course. One tape was labeled M, like Michael Ladies, M Ladies. And this showed Charles Ng cutting off the shirt of Brenda O'Connor with a knife, like we talked about, telling her, what he said. You can cry and stuff like the rest of them, but it won't do any good. We are pretty cold-hearted, so to speak, that thing. Another tape showed Kathleen Allen seated in the chair with Leonard Lake, warning her that if she doesn't go along with it, he'll, tie her down to the bed, do things to her, take her outside, take her life, and bury her on the property. And then they found the other tapes that showed Deborah Dubbs being assaulted so severely that investigators remember said that she, quote, could not have survived, unquote. Talking about this stuff is so difficult. This was not just evidence of crimes, the videotapes. These weren't just evidence. These were like snuff films, right? They were recordings of torture and unalivings that were made for Leonard Blake and Charles Ng's own pleasure and entertainment. And the investigators who watched these tapes, these are veteran homicide detectives who thought that they had seen everything, were absolutely, unequivocally traumatized by what they had witnessed. So Sheriff Claude Ballard, he was the sheriff of Calaveras County, and he held a press conference, and he described the tapes as, quote, like a horror film, vicious, 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 unquote. But there was one crucial piece of evidence missing at this time. Do we know what that piece of evidence is? Charles Ng. Remember? Because the coward ran away when he got caught stealing. After everything you've done, you run away because you freaking stole a bench vice. Anyway, yeah, Charles Ng was missing. Let's move on. After fleeing that lumber store on June 2nd, 1985, Charles Ng went straight to Cricket's house. He told her that he had to leave town immediately, and Cricket drove him to San Francisco International Airport. I'll be right back. Ariana, Santa is really close, so I think you should go to bed soon. Do you wanna look at the Santa tracker right now? Yeah, sure. Okay. Alright, hold on. Let's see. You ready? Ooh, where is he at? Where is he at? Where is he at? Ooh, look at him. Actually, he'll be in Ontario, Canada in 5 seconds. Okay. He's already delivered 6 billion gifts. He's in Canada. Oh, he's making a turn. Where's it going? He's in Tampa. No, he's in Canada. All right. It's time for bed, babe. Okay. Sorry, but you gotta. What are you gonna do here? What? Well, I don't know, but go to bed. At this point, I really feel like I need to say something, and I could be totally off base. It could be totally off base. I'm starting to get the vibe that Cricket, I feel like Cricket, never mind. At the very least, never mind. Never mind. I'm not going to speculate, but you guys, tell me what you think about Cricket down below at this point in the story. I'm super interested to hear your thoughts and feelings and opinions. They're all only opinions, and I'm there. And I welcome them all of them. Okay. Anyway, Cricket drove Charles Ng to San Francisco International Airport, and that is where he booked a flight to Chicago using the alias Mike Kimoto. Okay. So from Chicago, a friend apparently had those. He had those. Friend drove him from Detroit and across the border into our good friends Canada, which is actually where Santa is right now. We just checked on the tracker. He's in Canada. That's also where Charles Ng went. He eventually made his way into Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and then he lived there. He lived there completely undetected, apparently, in like some weird lean-to in Fish Creek Provincial Park. And he survived on like shoplifted and stolen food, because remember, Charles King is quite the thief, and whatever money he had left over. The FBI launched a massive manhunt, and Ng's description was distributed worldwide, not just domestically. We're talking about internationally. It was distributed through Interpol, and posters went up all across Canada. Authorities knew that he actually had sisters in Toronto and Calgary. He had an uncle in England. He had former Marine friends in Hawaii. And I mean, at this point, this man could literally be anywhere. However, Unravelers, Charles Ng had one fatal flaw. The man could not stop stealing. He had sticky ass fingers. He could not stop stealing. On July 6, 1985, just over a month after Lake's arrest, Charles Ng walked into Hudson's Bay department store in Calgary, and he shoplifted a can of salmon. This man must have been really hungry, really hungry. Were he a normal man, I might look the other way, and I might feel bad for someone who feels the need to steal a can of salmon. I might have some empathy and compassion for a human being who is so hungry that they need to steal a can of salmon. But this is Charles Ng, and therefore, Charles Ng is an idiot. A security guard, his name was Sean Doyle, spotted him and tried to detain him after, he saw him steal this can of salmon. What did Charles Ng do? Well, Charles Ng pulled out a 38 caliber Cobra revolver, and he shot Sean Doyle in the head. Somebody please come get this guy. Please come get this guy. But guess what? Despite being wounded, Sean Doyle actually, after being shot in the head, managed to disarm, and subdue Charles Ng until police arrived. 34-day manhunt was officially over. Charles Ng was in custody, but getting this man back to the United States would take another 6 years. and will probably take me another half an hour on this episode. So, hey, say hi again if you're still here. I know this one's deep and it's heavy, but I wanted to talk about it. So I'm glad you guys are here, still hanging in there. Let's talk about the extradition battle because it was a battle. I'm slumped at this point. We're going to keep pushing through the story because we have to. So Charles Ng was charged in Canada with the shoplifting, right? He was also charged with an assault with a weapon, possession of a concealed firearm as well. In December of 1985, he was convicted and sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. This is in Canada, okay? But California really wanted this guy for these murders, and that's where things got really complicated. Let me sit up. We can do this. We can do this. Okay. Canada, like a lot of other countries, opposes the death penalty, which we carry here in the United States, obviously. Under a 1976 treaty between the United States and Canada, Canada is not obligated in any way to extradite suspects to the US if they are facing capital punishment. Ng's attorneys argued that extraditing him to face murder charges in California, where he would be facing the death penalty for these crimes, would violate the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So this legal battle literally dragged on for years. Ng filed habeas corpus petitions. He appealed to the Alberta Court of Appeal. He challenged absolutely every aspect of the extradition order. Meanwhile, families of his victims waited and waited and waited. Finally, on September 26th, 1991, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled 4-3 in favor of extradition. According to former Alberta prosecutor Scott Newark, Canada deported Ng to California just 18 minutes after the ruling was announced. They were like, get the guy the fuck out of here. Get him out of here. You guys ruled in favor? Sayonara. Ng, get out of our, get gone. And he was. They wanted him gone before he could file another appeal. Like, this guy just kept playing this system. Like, Canada was tired of it. They were like, get out of here. Okay. So finally, Charles Ng was back in the United States 6 years after his initial arrest in Canada. Okay. But Charles Ng's trial in the United States wouldn't begin for another 7 years. Let me say that again for you guys. Did you hear me? 7 years. Yes, 7 years. In Calaveras County, Ng was indicted on 12 counts of first-degree murder. But before the trial could begin, Ng launched a very protracted series of legal maneuvers that would make this case the longest and most expensive in California history to that date. He sued the state over his temporary detention at Folsom Prison. He filed challenges against 4 different judges assigned to his case, resulting in 3 of them being removed. He went through 10 different attorneys, some of whom actually ended up having to defend him a second time. He filed a malpractice suit against several of his lawyers, citing incompetent representation. This man lodged complaints about everything. He lodged complaints about the strength of his eyeglasses. Yeah, like we give a Charles. Apparently, you're right. He complained about, he lodged, these are formal complaints, okay? complaints about the temperature of the food that he was being served in jail. I'm not kidding. He filed a complaint regarding his right to practice origami in his jail cell. He claimed that throughout this whole ordeal, he had completely lost trust and completely lost confidence in all of his lawyers and at that point Charles Ng, you're representing yourself, my friend. And he was allowed to, which delayed the trial for another year while he researched applicable laws. The trial was moved from Calaveras County to Orange County, of course, due to all of the pretrial publicity. Orange County was already bankrupt and would have to figure out how to pay for all of the litigation's hidden costs. And finally, on October 26th, 1998. Mark that shit on your calendar because it is, this is 13 years. Look, I'm losing my voice. I know this episode is probably only going to end up being like an hour and a half, but I swear to God, I've been recording for like 6 hours. And I researched for about 24 cumulative hours. Let me say that again. On October 26, 1998, which again is 13 years after his arrest, Charles Ng's trial finally begins. Primary jury selection started on September 14th. Opening arguments began on October 26th. And the trial would last 4 months. 4 months. You heard me. Prosecution's case, of course, was absolutely devastating. They had all of the videotapes that showed Charles Ng participating in all of the torture and sexual assault. They had Leonard Lake's journals that documented all of these crimes. They had a ton of physical evidence from the Williesville property. They had the testimony of Richard Carrazzo, the man who Ng shot, who was still able to identify him as the gunman who killed Donald Giletti. And Charles Ng's defense strategy was very simple. What do you guys think it was? Pause for a second. Let me know. Yes, you're right. Blame everything on Leonard Lake. That's exactly what he did. And he maintained that he was merely an observer, that Lake had planned and committed all of the kidnappings and unalivings, all unassisted, all on his own. He claimed that he was completely dependent on Leonard Lake for direction. He brought in the abuse of his father, of course, and said that, because of that, he suffered, and that should be a mitigating factor, and that his good behavior in prison should show the court that he should be imprisoned for life rather than executed. The defense actually called a psychiatrist named Dr. Stuart Gracian to the stand, who testified that Ng had dependent personality disorder. But under cross-examination, Dr. Gracian admitted that he had never actually viewed the tapes that showed Charles Ng very actively participating in the crimes. Clinical psychologist Abraham Nevad agreed with the diagnosis. And he said that Ng's behavior in the tapes indicated that he was trying to mirror and please Leonard Lake. 4 correctional officers, 2 sheriff's deputies, a prison library employee, and a prison counselor all testified that Charles Ng was a model prisoner. 4 former Marines testified that during his service, he was very quiet and well behaved. This man had far too many fucking people on his side. I gotta say. I have Charles Ng's parents flew from Hong Kong to testify. His father got on the stand and very tearfully admitted that he had enforced severe punishment on his son, believing at the time that it would make him a better citizen. But both parents got on that stand and pleaded for their son's life. And then, against his lawyer's advice, Charles Ng took the fucking stand. It was an absolute disaster. It was a disaster. Charles Ng testified that he actually had never killed anyone, that everything was Leonard Lake's doing. But the prosecution introduced additional evidence that contradicted his entire testimony, including a photo of Charles Ng in his prison cell with cartoons that he had sketched of his victims hanging on the wall behind him in prison. Lord, get me through this. Okay, so the jury began deliberations on February 8th of 1999. After 3 weeks, it took me 12 and a half minutes to make up my mind during my research, but it took the jury 3 weeks. Look at me. I'm getting all red in the face. What is happening? All right. After 3 weeks, they returned their verdict on February 24th, 1999. Guilty. 11 counts of first-degree murder. The jury found him not guilty on the 12th charge, which was for the murder of Paul Costner, even though Lake and Ng had driven Costner's car for 7 months, and Costner's driver's license had been found at the property, and it was literally the car that Leonard Lake was arrested in, the car that Charles Ng had thrown the bench vise into the trunk of. Jesus. Okay. Anyway. All right. On June 30th, 1999 was the sentencing of Charles Ng, and he was sentenced to death. Judge John J. Ryan rejected a motion to reduce the sentence to life imprisonment, saying, quote, Mr. Ng was not under any duress, nor does the evidence support that he was under the domination of Leonard Lake, unquote. The trial had cost the state of California approximately $20 million, making it the most expensive trial in the state's history at that time, far exceeding even the O.J. Simpson trial cost about $9 million. So, okay, where are we now? Where are we now? This is more than 40 years after these crimes were committed. And guess what? Charles Ng, here he is kind of now. Charles Ng is still on death row in a California medical facility. He's been there since 1999. No executions have taken place in California since 2006. And in 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order placing a moratorium on the death penalty in the state. In July of 2022, the California Supreme Court upheld Ng's death sentence and conviction, but with the moratorium in place, it's actually quite unlikely that Charles Ng will ever be executed. For the families of the victims, justice came so incredibly slowly. 14 years passed between the discovery of the crimes and Charles Ng's convictions. 14 years. 14 years of waiting, of reliving that horror. Every single time there was a court hearing or a legal motion filed, 14 years of wondering if Charles Ng would somehow again escape punishment. Dwight and Lola Stapley, these are the parents of the victim, Robin Scott Stapley. They attended the trial, and in a letter written during the proceedings, they described watching Charles Ng on the witness stand, quote, blatantly lying, unquote, as absolute torture for them. They said, quote, we scream internally in the worst kind of agony every time Scott's name is mentioned in court, and we are reminded of what happened to our youngest son, unquote. When the verdict came in, Lola Stapley said, quote, justice wasn't swift. Sometimes justice really is like molasses in January, but you have to laugh about it, because if you don't laugh, you'll cry. unquote. The case of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng remains one of the most disturbing, in my opinion, in American history, not just because of the number of victims and possible victims, but because of the very calculated, very methodical nature of their crimes. These were not crimes of passion. These were not like moments of rage. These were all planned. They were all documented, and they were all executed with very chilling precision. Leonard Lake's Operation Miranda was not just a fantasy. Again, it was a blueprint for absolute evil. He built a torture chamber. He wrote detailed journals. He made videotapes explaining his twisted philosophy. And he truly believed that he had the right to kidnap, enslave, and take the lives of women simply because he wanted to. And Charles Ng, he's found in Leonard Lake, I guess, a mentor and a brother and a father figure, right? Someone who validated his own violent impulses. And together, they created a nightmare that claimed at least 11 lives, and I feel like possibly many more. But here's what we need to remember. This case was solved because of that stupid $75 bench vice. Like, if Charles Ng hadn't been a compulsive shoplifter, if he'd just paid for that vice or left it on the shelf, Leonard Lake and Charles Ng might have continued doing this for years. Years. How many more victims would there have been? How many more families would have been completely destroyed by these two men? Sometimes justice comes down to the smallest things. A shoplifted item, a suspicious police officer, a cyanide pill that ends one killer's life but completely exposes all of his and his partner's crimes. The Williesville cabin is gone now. It was torn down years ago. Thank God. The property has changed hands. The bunker has also been demolished, but the memory of what happened there absolutely remains. The families of the victims every day remember what happened there. The investigators who worked the case absolutely remember what happened there. And now you and me, we remember because we have to. We have to. We remember Donald Lake, who just wanted to visit his brother. We remember Charles, God, every time. We remember Charles Gunner, who thought that he was just going on a road trip with a friend. We remember the Dubs family, Harvey, Deborah, and baby Sean. We remember Paul Costner, who was just trying to sell his car. We remember the Band O'Connor family, right? Lonnie Sr., Brenda, and baby Lonnie Jr. And we remember their friend, Robin Stapley. We remember Kathleen Allen, Michael Carroll, Clifford Parenteau, Jeffrey Gerald, Donald Giulietti, Randy Jacobson, Cheryl Okuro, Maurice Rock, and Reggie Frisbee. Every single one of them. And we remember the 15 women whose photographs were on a wall at that house, but whose names we may never know. This case teaches us something very important. Again, I've said it a million times, I'll say it a million more. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Leonard looked like some old survivalist hippie, right? A guy who maybe was a little bit weird, but totally harmless. And Charles Ng looked like a quiet former Marine. They lived in some remote cabin. They kept to themselves, and nobody suspected a single thing until a $75 bench buys changed absolutely everything. Oh, my loves, my unravelers. I'm getting red in the face. This case is heavy, it's deep. The research and the retelling has definitely taken its toll. So I'm going to leave you with stay vigilant, pay attention, to the people around you. If something feels wrong, trust your instincts. Please always report suspicious activity, because I'm telling you, sometimes the difference between life and death, between justice and impunity, comes down to one single person who notices something off and decides to say or do something about it. The victims of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, they didn't get that chance, but maybe by remembering their story, by understanding how these crimes happened and how they were finally stopped, I guess our hope, people like me, people who do this, our hope is that maybe a tragedy can be prevented in the future. Holy crap, we made it. You guys made it. If you're still here, oh my God, I love you. Merry Christmas. Is it Christmas? It is. It's officially Christmas. Merry Christmas. I've so many amazing things to be thankful for this year. And while this holiday season has been a little bit different for me and a little bit of a struggle, it's still beautiful. It's just all been such a gift. So I hope that you have an amazing holiday, whatever you celebrate. I hope you have an amazing holiday. I hope you're with the people that you love and the people that love you the most. And that's the end of 'Tis the Serial season for this year. So it was fun. I do have a case that I'm going to talk about early next week, or maybe this weekend, actually. Trial is coming up soon, so I want to do a deep dive on that and get everybody ready for trial if I can. I love you guys so much. I never know what to say at the end of these long ones, but that's it. Thanks for hanging out with me. Until I see you again, please, please stay safe. Keep asking questions and keep unraveling. Love you.